Good morning, everyone. Thank you for braving day 2. And thank you for those who have joined us. We've had some great additions of folks who got released from weather restrictions and got here. Especially Haley Book from the Pennsylvania PUC has joined us. Keith Welks from Pennsylvania Treasury, and John Hanger, former Secretary of DEP, Secretary of Policy, and gubernatorial candidate in Pennsylvania, as well as others. And so we will try to catch everyone up to speed quickly. I do want to thank Mara and Mark for all their work to make this technology stuff work yesterday. It was. And John Walliser is headed off as a production assistant to Hollywood now. So thank you all for doing that. And also want to recognize Eleonora, who's been working with us on a lot of the conference work in Lindsay's absence and has been phenomenal doing that. Sue Gold, Sally Tardy, and the others who've been making this all work. So thank you all for getting through yesterday with us. Today is much easier from a technology point of view. We are still doing the webinar, still going out, but people aren't going to be coming in, so that simplifies it a bunch. And I'm not sure why everybody's here, because we obviously solved all the world's problems yesterday, so we could just go home. I'm calling today the So What Day. We heard phenomenal presentations, information yesterday on a lot of different technologies, and really understanding some of what we're facing. So today is how do we take that and apply it to Pennsylvania, maybe other places as well, but different ways of thinking. And some of the takeaways I got from yesterday, which may be right, may be wrong, or open for debate, I didn't hear anybody question the need for deep decarbonization. Neil and Granger set up phenomenal presentations, did that, and we didn't. Does that mean that nobody questions it? Is it just because in the room everybody thinks that, or is that something that we have to test further? But yesterday was pretty compelling, saying deep decarbonization is what we have to do. And I was also really interested in some of Granger's research that he talked about, alluding to what I was calling the societal climate literacy. That people really don't get this. The distinction also that was there between air pollution and CO2 issues, but also that people really don't get what we're talking about. And in this room, it may be a common language, but there isn't one out there. And I don't think anybody questioned whether there should be renewables in a mix, or that renewables should be pursued. But questions of how you do it and how much. May have been raised that probably are worth some further discussion going forward. And maybe that would be anchored by Jesse Jenkins' flexible base approach that he talked about, presented, but that's also great fodder for discussion going forward. And then the questions were raised about the economics. Why do you invest in this stuff if you can't get the money back? What's Dave Grossman's questions that seem to be at every session, may have been encouraged at every session. The nuclear discussion, there are questions. There are big ones with nuclear, and both about the current fleet and about the future nuclear deployment, especially in the U.S. How does that play out? What do we do with issues that are facing us now with the current fleet, and what are the impacts if you lose some of that? And I think some of the debate about whether renewables can take that up, leaving a lot of room for discussion. Energy efficiency, I have to admit, I don't understand as well. There are people in the room who really do, and I need to understand that better, everything, all the aspects of it, and that's something that I think we'll be looking at going forward. And CCS, there is debate about it, as we saw, but it also appears to be in most people's ideas of being able to achieve deep decarbonization. There's a big chunk of capture and storage in whatever way. But I think in that discussion also, Jenny brought in a critical piece to the discussion that we may have forgotten somewhat, whether you agree with where she got or not as a result of that. But we haven't really included people in this discussion, what the impacts are, and how this works on this society, what we're the broad impacts of what she talked about as our carbon-based culture, how that goes. So I think we do need to think about that somewhat, figure out what this means beyond the technologies. How does what we put together and talk about impact people, communities. And we need your help in figuring that out. So that comes to the so what. And it's really figuring out if deep decarbonization is the right way to go for Pennsylvania. I didn't hear anybody say it wasn't yesterday. And if so, what do we do? How do we get to that? And the final answers aren't today, but hopefully we can work on putting together a roadmap for how we do that in Pennsylvania and maybe beyond. We've got, as I said yesterday, we're here to try to grab all this information and this brilliance from all of you to help us think about that and put something forward. And that's what we're going to be doing coming out of this. So today's setup is we're going to start with a panel of 3 national/international groups, what they generally think about climate, how they address the issues, and then what they think might be appropriate for Pennsylvania, and that's hopefully going to devolve into a discussion with all of you even during that panel. We're then going to talk about an example of a path forward. Jay Edmonds is going to talk with us about the mid-century plan and take us through that. And then we're going to break out fully into groups and really get down to the so what. I mean, what do we do next? Where does this go? So this is really our plea to you for help in thinking this forward. And with that, I want to move to our first panel this morning and ask them to come up. And Jason Albritton from the Nature Conservancy, Armond Cohen, Clean Air Task Force, and Andrew Williams, pinch hitting for Mark Brownstein from the Environmental Defense Fund. And while they're coming up, I stole this from the table this morning that was out there. It says, "Our planet is in good hands, yours." And it's about greenware. And it's sort of, this goes to the issue that really there are so many environmental issues out there. People, you can talk about recycling, you can talk about the Chesapeake Bay, we talk about all these things, and how do we also manage these for an organization like ours where we're dealing with these as we go forward, also talking about climate. So I think we can't forget that there are these other issues, but those other issues can't forget that this may be the existential question. So, I mean, obviously muddled on that, but looking forward. All right, so for this panel, I'm going to start with Andrew Williams, actually.
You want us to stand up, Davitt?
You can if you want to, yeah, either way. So this is really talking about, what do you guys think about climate? What do you do for it to make it all better?
Look, so I apologize Mark wasn't able to be here. He had a couple of different issues. I've met most of you in the room. Again, my name is Andrew Williams. I'm going to assume most of you know who the Environmental Defense Fund is, but for those of you who do not, EDF is an international climate-based organization really focused on the merger between science, law, and policy. We look for the practical or pragmatic solutions to a whole suite of environmental issues and really look for market-based solutions where those can be made to fit. Sort of one aspect of our work that allows us to partner with a broad variety of partners, sometimes even industry. Also an aspect of our work that does not come without its fair share of criticism. But with that, we look to collaborate where we can and really only use confrontation where we have to. So as it relates to what we heard yesterday, a whole bunch of interesting things, and admittingly, some of them are out of the purview of my specific expertise at EDF. But I wanted to mention specifically on nuclear power. So EDF doesn't really take a position on one different technology or one different natural gas generation asset base. And we really don't have a firm position on nuclear power. But in the past, we have been willing to come to the table where there's a clear understanding that renewables can be incentivized through a negotiating table, et cetera, and carbon can be reduced. And I'm happy to answer any specific questions any of you may have. But for all intents and purposes, we don't actually have a formal opinion or position on nuclear energy. But on clean energy, it's different. I mean, our goal is pretty clear. And that is to reduce carbon emissions, really from the power sector, which is by far the biggest emitter of carbon. But it doesn't stop there, right? Carbon also comes from other sources, and many of those sources are near and dear here to the hearts of Pennsylvanians and are relative to the natural gas industry. Which I'll talk about here in a second, but conceptually, really, all the technologies we heard about yesterday are possibilities. Especially globally, you heard about this morning from Davitt, Carbon capture is definitely one of the tools we need in the toolbox. We really need all of them, right? But there's no one silver bullet, as we would like to say. Probably not even renewable power or options can save the entire day. Really because regions will change over time, opportunities will change over time, geographies, while geography doesn't change, the dynamics and conditions of different geographies definitely change, and solutions will morph and essentially be different and change. So a one solution fits all approach is really not where we focus. But what I would like to reflect on is the role of natural gas, specifically here in Pennsylvania. We sit in the Marcellus Shale region that's quickly becoming one of the largest shale plays in the world, actually. And the way we like to think about this really is in three ways, right? First, there's sort of the panoply of issues associated with actually producing natural gas. So you heard a little bit about the community impacts yesterday from Jenny, and then this morning from Davitt. Things like truck traffic, actually drilling wells, noise, habitat fragmentation, which we talked a little bit about yesterday with CMU and offline with some of you. Things that may not actually be the #1 issue, even globally, but things that matter to the community and matter to Pennsylvanians, and things that we should be talking about here, because in truth, natural gas really cannot be the cleaner option when compared to other fossil fuels and coal if we don't deal with the front-end impacts. And another one of those front-end impacts, as most of you know and have probably heard from me in the past, is also dealing with the air emissions side, which we at EDF focus primarily on methane emissions that are leaked across the natural gas supply chain. You heard a lot about the climate impacts and the predictability and really the uncertainty that comes along with climate change generally. And it's estimated that methane emissions, and oil and gas, by the way, is largely the biggest industrial source of methane emissions, definitely here in the US. But 25% of those impacts that we experience today come from and are associated with methane emissions. So there's an obvious reason why we need to at least tackle methane in the short term. And really there's a worry, right? Because the third issue that I'd like to flag is that even if we deal with all of the front-end impacts of natural gas development, from the power sector standpoint, from actually producing the gas, from reducing the air emissions, really at the core, natural gas is still a carbon-based fuel, right? So we need to do all we can to ensure that we don't actually lock in natural gas and move too quickly in the transition to a more renewably centric or even no-carbon future. I think that's a big point that we didn't necessarily talk about yesterday. This brings up another point that I think you heard about after lunch a little bit yesterday, and that's in order to get to a dynamic world where low-priced renewables are competitive with low-priced gas, which we can argue about this later or not, is largely the reason why we've seen a reduction in coal-fired generation in the U.S. And globally over the market-driven reason. It's not because of regulation. It's not because of the federal government overreach or even Pennsylvania governmental overreach. It's because the markets are driving the decommission of coal plants, largely due to the low price of natural gas. But yet to develop policies that really incentivize or have the potential to incentivize renewable development and lower our carbon mix from an electricity generation standpoint moving forward, we have to reform the markets. And I'm not just talking about what we heard yesterday from an electricity capacity market or wholesale market. I'm also talking about the natural gas wholesale market and pricing in new services like end-of-day nominations, a more dynamic way of selling and actually completing transactions for natural gas, which hopefully will bring down the need, arguably, over the future for natural gas infrastructure overbuild, while at the same time working on policies that optimize the electric grid within that focus of sort of in tandem, looking at the issues associated with natural gas system growth. And I'm going to stop there, actually, because I'm sure we'll have some time for questions at the end. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Name, rank, serial number.
Okay, great. Okay, actually, I'll just talk from here. Great. Thanks, everyone. I'd like to, first of all, I just want to say I do a lot of these conferences on climate, and this is actually internationally or nationally, I was telling Davitt last night, I think this is the most comprehensive and sort of down to brass tacks meeting I've been at in a couple of years. That is, you're actually trying to connect the high-level goals to actually what would you actually do on the ground, and I think that's just really commendable, and I'm excited about the conversations in the next few hours. I'm just going to touch on three things, kind of the risk management framework we heard about yesterday, maybe what some sweet spots are for Pennsylvania in what is ultimately a global effort, and then finally a couple comments on politics and culture and the human issues as were raised yesterday. So, you know, the first takeaway from yesterday was this is a unbelievably hairy problem. We're just talking about the global energy system, which has evolved over 100 years and which just needs to be completely transformed over about 50 if we're to survive. So let's start with a little bit of humility, and we heard that from a couple speakers. I think the meta message from yesterday, I hope you take away, is that there are a variety of options possible, either extant today or in the near future, to deal with this problem. The portfolio approach, I know it's kind of sounds like a cliche, but it's something we do to manage most everything. Kind of proceeding on all paths at once, enthusiastically and cheerfully, rather than grudgingly, might be really important. And now there were some views expressed yesterday that, maybe we really don't need to think too much about nuclear. Maybe we don't really need to deal with carbon capture. Maybe we can, just to take one study on 100% renewables that's very famous, maybe, and this is for every state like Pennsylvania, maybe we can build 40 offshore wind farms, each of them the size of the largest offshore wind farm in the world. And in Pennsylvania, maybe we can build 40 wind farms onshore that are each the size of the largest onshore wind farms in the world. And maybe we can, build a storage system that's twice the size of the electric system. And maybe we can develop, concentrated solar at, at 1,000 times our current level. I mean, maybe that'll all work. Maybe it won't. And I think the question isn't really who's right. The question is, what kind of bet do you want to make? And do you want to put all your bets in one direction? And I think you heard from some speakers yesterday who said, yeah, we'll take that bet. We actually dislike, I think our last speaker said, I fundamentally dislike the social implications of some technologies so much that I'm basically willing to take the risk that we can solve climate. We can solve climate just on one pathway. In that case, it was the renewables pathway. I think this is a big issue. I've been at the climate issue for many, many years, and I think you have to decide: are you solving the climate problem, or are you solving every social problem in the world, and trying to satisfy every perspective? And I think that has to be an honest conversation. I sense in this room, folks tend to be a little more pragmatic about, like, let's actually see if we can actually reduce carbon as fast as possible. And we have to be mindful of all the, the externalities or the non-carbon aspects of certain technologies. Absolutely. Do you want to be super sensitive in the way you develop everything? Absolutely. But do you want to kind of try and focus on carbon, or don't you? And I think that's a pretty important fork in the road. So, that's the perspective, at least, I come at this from. The other thing we have to keep in mind is the global view. It's all well and good for us to talk about Americans, cutting back on energy use and about us, investing in a grid that would be extremely large and have lots of redundant backup in order to serve a wind and solar-based system. Is that going to work in India? Do you think India wants to sort of say, yeah, fine, we'll build an intermittent grid which has huge swings, and we'll build a whole backup system of storage and maybe a lot of backup generation to support that? I've been in India. I don't think they're all that enthusiastic about that vision. So we talk about politics. We have to think about global as well. Okay, sweet spot for Pennsylvania. I think that we start with the facts on the ground. You're not going to be the solar capital of the world. Okay, let's just start there. It's yes, solar will have some role, but this is not going to power the 21st century grid in Pennsylvania to any great degree. What you have some wind resource, although I gather siting is not a walk in the park here. And that's even if we could do this 100% renewables vision, Pennsylvania is probably not the place where that's going to happen first. What do you have? You have a large natural gas endowment, obviously, and I think that's a huge opportunity for you to lead the world. And the areas where I would focus, I certainly agree with Andrew that uncontrolled gas is not an endpoint for climate. It may be an immediate, an intermediate bridge, and where it's bringing down some of the near-term, issues from it's displacing some coal in the near term, but it's not the long-term play. So what do you do? Well, there's carbon capture and storage for gas being demonstrated. I mean, it's very feasible, and it's being demonstrated right now in Houston we heard about the Net Power plant yesterday. There's taking the gas endowment and turning it into low-carbon liquid fuels. Ammonia is one pathway for doing that. That requires carbon capture. And then we have to think about, possibly Pennsylvania as, just doing direct CCS on existing coal and gas, not necessarily greenfield. You've got the interesting opportunity that you got a lot of pore space from fracking. That could be a very interesting kind of synergy in terms of, storing CO2 extracted from fossil generation into pore space that's freed up by fracking. And then finally, there's actually the possibility of using CO2 extracted from fossil energy as a fracking fluid, which has actually been experimented with. So you've got some interesting possible zero carbon closed loops here that because of your huge natural gas endowment and because of your fossil infrastructure could be a very interesting test space. Nuclear. Not only was Pennsylvania the birth of the oil industry, it was also the birth of the civilian nuclear power industry with Shippingport. You have a huge amount of intellectual resource here. Westinghouse, which is not in great shape these days, but is still a thriving company in the areas that it's still thriving with lots of technical expertise sitting here in Pittsburgh. You've got Penn State, you've got Carnegie, you've got other institutions with a lot of firepower in that area. So I'd say civilian nuclear power is an important potential area, and particularly in the advanced reactor space. Think about the amount of supply chain and sort of high-level knowledge content Pennsylvania has to offer that in that area. And one kind of humble thought might be, to think about positioning Pennsylvania very well to demonstrate some of these advanced reactors as they become available in the next decade. I think I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you. All right, Jason, you're sitting in D.C., that place that everybody wants to be today.
That's not what I usually hear,
yeah,
but I think we're part of the swamp, as they say.
Yes. So in draining that, sort of your thoughts of looking at all this.
Sure. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Nature Conservancy is doing and us as an organization. And I think my comments are going to focus more on the politics than the kind of technology-focused discussion that I know a lot has happened yesterday and today. First, just a little bit about TNC. I'm sure many of you are familiar with TNC here in Pennsylvania, our Pennsylvania chapter. We at the Nature Conservancy are a large organization. We're in all 50 states in the U.S. and 69 countries across the world. So we're a global organization. So our perspective, while we work on the ground in every state in the country, we kind of bring an international perspective, and particularly recently on climate change and what that means. And for us as an organization, we have agreement top to bottom within the organization that climate change really is the most critical issue that we're facing. All of our conservation goals, all of the things that we're trying to do are impacted by climate change and arguably could be undermined by climate change. So while it is by far the most challenging issue to deal with and the hardest one to have an impact on, it's fundamental to our mission and to being able to achieve our mission. And so the organization has committed to figure out how we're going to do this. How are we as an organization going to contribute to addressing the climate challenge? And it's a global challenge, as was pointed out. But that doesn't mean that we don't, because it is a global challenge, it does not mean we don't work in every state, in every place, in every country that we work, because you have to work from the ground up to achieve some of those global solutions. So, big picture, we as an organization believe we have to reduce warming well below the 2 degrees Celsius mark that scientists tell us that has to be the target to avoid the most serious impacts. We also know that requires an international global solution. We've started laying the groundwork on that through the recent Paris Agreement, but there's a lot of uncertainty whether, one, that's not ambitious enough to achieve our emissions, and the political situation, particularly in the U.S. now, seems to be taking a step backwards instead of a step forward in achieving that. So we at the Nature Conservancy, particularly here in the U.S., have said, well, what is our contribution to that, and how do we help change the dynamic and move the ball forward given these kind of challenging dynamics? One of our strategies and our kind of central U.S.-based strategy is what we call the 50-state strategy. That means we're working in every state in the U.S. to try to move the climate conversation or climate action forward in some way. And that varies a lot. I mean, some places like Pennsylvania are quite advanced in that work and looking at engaging in energy policy discussions and climate conversations about how we can move that forward. In other states where the political environment is even more challenging, take much more limited steps. But the point is that we've decided if we don't work everywhere on this issue, we're not going to have a chance of success at that. And so that's something that the organization is committed to and is a relatively new strategy for us, but one that we feel is essential to achieving our fundamental goals. And so why, if it is a global issue, if it requires international solutions, why are we working in 50 states? And the theory there, and I think the theory of change that we subscribe to, is that a bottom-up approach demonstrating in individual places that things are achievable, that we can move the ball forward, is essential to kind of building up to both national action in the U.S. and ultimately international action, with the U.S. being the world's largest economy and a global leader on a variety of issues, but in particularly on this issue. Within that, too, a lot of what our focus has been is how do we change the political conversation around climate and clean energy? How do we, in particular, rebuild what we call the moderate center on climate change? Because what our theory is, and what we've learned, is that if we're ever going to get the type of policy change that we need, which in the U.S. likely has to be at the national level and has to be a price on carbon or some policy that is either the single policy or combination policies are economy-wide and are moving emissions down to meet these very steep reductions. We cannot do that politically if the conversation is not changed from what it is now. And if we don't have moderate Republicans, moderate Democrats, the kind of middle of the political spectrum bought into that, one, this is a problem and that we need to find solutions for it. So a lot of our work has been less focused on any one specific policy solution, whether it's renewables or, talked about CCS, talked about a lot of different potential pathways, but how do we take the opportunities in front of us? How do we use that to engage this kind of both constituencies, policymakers, to build that center out, to build a case for why we need to act on climate, and to build support over time to hopefully the ultimate goal, and if we don't reach the ultimate goal, we probably won't be successful at meeting our goals, is some type of policy at the national level that commits us and achieves steep reductions in carbon emissions. And so it's a long-term strategy. It's not a strategy with a clear path forward. It's not a strategy where we can say this X, Y, and Z are going to achieve it, but we know if we don't start working on that now, we will not have a chance at having success for the long-term goal, which is steep emissions reductions. So I think, building on a number of the comments of my co-panelists here, I think it does take an approach that looks at a lot of different options. It looks at what's achievable now with the goal in mind of much steeper reductions in the future that probably aren't achievable now, but we have to get on a pathway. We have to start making the investments both politically and in policies that put us on a path to getting there. And I know, particularly in the current political environment, a lot of, all you hear in the media is about the U.S. walking back on climate change. It's challenging to see what those pathways are, but one thing, and I've worked in politics for a number of years now, whatever political view drives the day today will probably change again in 3 to 4 years. We do kind of have violent swings here. So it's important to kind of have a steady course, an end goal that we know we're going for. Deep decarbonization that this conference is about is that type of end goal. We know we need these kind of reductions, but we also know that we have to be realistic about what's achievable now, how we can achieve it, who we need to engage to achieve it, and start down that path, even if we know we can't get to the end result for quite a bit of time in the future. So I think it's important, and I think that's why this conference is important, to say, is this the right goal? I think, as Davitt pointed out at the beginning, everyone seems to agree that yes, nobody's questioning that this is the right goal, but it's a question of how do we achieve it? And I think what I would encourage, based on our work, is that I think we have to be open to what's achievable now, thinking about that long-term goal, thinking about the politics now and how we engage in that, but with a goal of moving that over time, and not become overcommitted to any one solution or policy at this point in time. TNC has not picked any one policy that is our end goal, but we have a goal of an emissions reduction that we do drive towards every day, and we try to see where the policy mixes and political situation fits into that end goal. So I think that's it's a way that you can think about what are the options moving forward coming out of this conference. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you all. All right. Reactions, thoughts, challenges, questions. The microphones are going to start running around. That terrible silence. Is that on? No.
No. Now it's working.
There.
Hi, Eric Gimon with Energy Innovation. I just wanted to address a few points. One problem with CCS as a direction for politically or practically here in Pennsylvania is that typically it's a bolt-on solution, right? If you think about most of the powers, it's you consume, except for net power. And if it's a bolt-on solution, it needs a business case, and the business case is driven by some kind of carbon pricing, which doesn't exist today. The net power case is more interesting because it's the technology uses carbon dioxide as the working fluid, and so it's inherent to the technology, and it's a competing technology at the same price level as current technology. So I think from the point of view of somebody in Pennsylvania who's interested in CCS, I would look at that technology as probably the most interesting one to track, because if you can get a competitive advantage in that space, it's something that's naturally going to compete in the marketplace in a place where natural gas is really cheap.
Go ahead.
The other point I would make is I wouldn't write off solar so dismissively, Armond, in the sense that the resource here is 20 to 30% worse than it is in Arizona, but it's 20 to 30% worse. It's not half, 3 times worse, or 5 times worse. And 20 or 30% are cost drops sudden cost drops that we see in the space of a few years sometimes in solar. For example, we've seen solar panels drop 30% from August to December of last year. So I would track that technology if I was activist here. And the reason is, it's not because I just like gung-ho for solar. It's a really good community solution. So if you're working with communities like towns or townships or larger towns like that want to have a citizens climate plan or whatever, it's something they can do to build a solar farm that feeds their cities, feeds their community, and so on. If you look at, and you see that all over the country, including in Ohio. Right? So it's not like it's that far out of reach for Pennsylvania, and it is a way to empower and get people to participate. And then on the kind of large utility scale end, there's still offshore wind. I mean, there's that little bit of Pennsylvania that's on the lake that
Yeah.
could access
Yeah.
offshore. So I just wanted to make some of those points.
Yeah, just a quick response. Eric, I agree with you that the net power stuff, which again, just to reiterate, I mean, this is a technology that at least the developers are claiming that they can basically deliver carbon-free gas power to the fence line and CO2 to the fence line at the same cost as a combined cycle gas plant today. There still would be a cost for disposal, but it's a pretty small cost, about $10 a ton. So I agree, Eric, that's the most promising technology. There's some other contenders. There is a larger point, though, which is true CCS needs a carbon price if you don't have a cost parity from the core generating resource, but so does everything else almost, except some onshore wind, and that's even if you exclude, you know, the backup issues. So let's be fair. Everything that's zero carbon tends to cost a bit more than gas right now. Well, okay, well, maybe you don't agree, but I think that there's really, I mean, you look at the EIA numbers or any other numbers and you see that. So we're going to need a carbon price for everything. I mean, if you're willing to just stipulate that we remove all subsidies and carbon prices and renewables will just take over, you know, I'll take that bet. On the solar point, agree, there's some potential. I just think when you look at these 100% renewable studies that have 30% of Pennsylvania's energy coming from solar, you know, I think that's quite a stretch. It's not so much that the actual insulation is less, it's the seasonality. Compare us to, you know, Pennsylvania to Arizona, the seasonality problem is just much greater than it is in Southern California. You have much longer multi-week kind of troughs. So I think that's where the economic issues. And I totally agree with you that let's engage people wherever they can, you know, and solar is a great, you know, is a great engagement tool. It's warm and fuzzy. People like it, great. But let's, you know, there's a difference between realistically seeing it as a tactical strategy to engage and saying it's the whole solution, or
So, Eric,
even half the solution.
Discussion to be continued. Anybody else want to say anything on this one? Okay, go ahead.
Greg Kachansky with the Thomas Merton Center here in Pittsburgh. One thing which hasn't been mentioned, that is not quite real yet, but it might be, is the Tesla's claim that they're going to have a solar roof that's as cheap as a regular roof. And that's really, if it becomes real, it's a game changer, because right now when people put solar on roofs, they're essentially putting another roof on top. So that there's substantial costs, and if you count the whole roof system as a unit, you could effectively make the cost of solar possibly go to zero, at which point the economics changes a lot. I just want to put it out there because it might become real in the next year or a few years.
Yeah. Anybody want to say anything on that one?
What do we do when the sun doesn't shine for a week?
Oh, sure,
mix it.
but
No,
there's a difference between having solar, which has capital costs and is expensive and is intermittent, and having solar, which is basically free because you need a roof anyway, and it's intermittent.
Bobby.
A couple points on that regard. Bobby McGinstry from Ballard's Bar. One, when you were talking about CCS, I will add an additional issue for Pennsylvania. We have a lot of waste coal facilities, and probably they're a central part of the strategy for meeting the $12 billion abandoned minelands problem in Pennsylvania. Now, ARIPA, the trade organization, did, when John Quigley was secretary, did have several meetings regarding carbon capture and reuse, and it seems that the Petronova and boundary dams show that there is a feasible add-on technology. So is that, which is some electricity, but also those facilities use abandoned piles, which are right now producing carbon dioxide emissions, as well as a witch's brew of other pollutants. With that, did you see that as a feasible mechanism, and what types of mechanisms might be used to really encourage use of that technology?
Bobby, I haven't looked at the waste coal situation in Pennsylvania. As a general matter, I think the issue with carbon capture is the point that Eric made, which is that it does have a cost hurdle because it is an add-on. Again, we can compare it, the cost of carbon removal from CCS as a bolt-on to other options, and you can go look at EIA's report and other things, and it's pretty competitive with some other options, so you don't rule it out. But it will have that, obviously, cost hurdle.
Anybody else?
I mean, I think there's an opportunity, right, to look at a suite of different technologies in Pennsylvania, right? Obviously, the waste coal issue is a big issue here in the state, not only from an environmental standpoint, but there are a lot of community impacts, right, associated with where that waste coal is stored. So a multitude of issues. But at its core, and arguably this panel's focused right on deep decarbonization. And our focus, at least at EDF, has been on where can we find those sources that actually have a lower carbon footprint than some of the generation that's out there now. And we haven't looked at the whole state as it relates to waste coal, but at least there's an argument to be made there that we may not actually be making a move towards a lower carbon generation type of a framework. But it's definitely a conversation that we're involved in and look at as a possible discussion, right? Discussion table for the future. We can talk about that in the breakout session as well if you want, Bobby.
Okay, Barrett, Lars, Christiane.
Barrett Brown from Drinker Biddle. I'm stunned that we managed to have 4 people here and nobody even mentioned energy efficiency except to be skeptical about it.
Not skeptical, not smart enough.
And energy efficiency is cheaper than gas. It's a larger resource than any other resource in Pennsylvania. There's no building built out there that can't have its energy use reduced by 40–50%. And it requires local labor and local jobs, and it's kind of the first thing we do, rather than something that we didn't forget to mention. And I hope we'll all understand that that's the first thing the state has to do and take it seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I can
Use the mic, closer to the mic.
Yep. Sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, so EDF's focus, and not only in Pennsylvania but nationwide, is definitely on, from a clean energy standpoint, on energy efficiency, arguably at first, right, as we sort of look at how you become more efficient from an overall market standpoint. And I think there are some opportunities actually here in Pennsylvania, right, not only that are in the legislature now, solutions being talked about, but also that John Hanger here in the room was working on, as well as then Secretary Quigley at the DEP and now Acting Secretary McDonald, have definitely been looking at, and the PUC, right, obviously at energy efficiency, and that's a very large part of our focus, and I think should be a large focus of sort of the overall framework of Pennsylvania policy moving forward. But that doesn't mean that that's the only thing, right? I mean, it's a big percentage of what we should be focused on, but also demand response and distributed generation, pricing all those new and different services, well, arguably new and different in some ways, into the marketplace. I think it's really an overall all options portfolio approach, as Armond put it, not to be cliche, right? But yeah, I totally agree. And we should have talked a little bit more about that, but that's a big part of, at least for sure, Pennsylvania's future.
That's it.
Yeah, and I agree with all of that, and my lack of mentioning does not mean that energy efficiency is not one of the strategies that we think fits into this portfolio of things that we need to be doing, and lowering energy demand obviously is important, but it's balanced with, we have to look at all of the solutions, that being one of them. But the Nature Conservancy definitely has invested in and believes energy efficiency is part of the solution.
Lars.
My name, I'm not used to speaking to these things, but anyway, a year and a half ago, I would have introduced myself as a coal miner. But I left that industry because I think they're being a bit dishonest. On the other hand, I still have a bunch of relatives. Over the holidays, my brother and I were yelling and screaming at each other, aggravating, carbon. So, Jason, my question is mainly to you, because I live in the southwestern corner of the state, which we'll call even, I know we're not allowed to talk about West Virginia. Anyway, my question is about the education, because if you think about it, there's not many coal miners left. It's a small industry relative to the rest of the country, but the election was hugely influenced by West Virginia, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, places like that. So as far as education, and I compliment you for saying you work in all 50 states. That's really struck me what you just said. So I wanted to learn more about the work that you do in places like southwestern Pennsylvania, excluding Allegheny County. I'm talking about Washington County, Greene County, West Virginia, Kentucky. Is it education, but also they need replacement industries, in my opinion. And I don't think that the new governor of West Virginia said expand tourism while he owns the Greenbrier Resort. I don't know that expanding tourism is the answer, but I'm just interested in the work that you're doing in places like that.
So I'm not going to be the expert on getting into exactly what we do, and some of my colleagues from the Pennsylvania Nature Conservancy are here, and I'm sure happy to talk to you later about our work in different parts of the state. But I do think, I mean, I'm from Western Kentucky originally, very coal heavy, so I have family and friends that have worked in that industry. So personally, I understand that. I mean, it's a critical issue, and when we look at the the political situation in this country, whatever solution we ended up getting to that reduces carbon has to realize that there are people affected by that, and policies have to be designed in a way that can get support broadly and find an economic transition that's workable for people negatively affected. And so I mean, we work in all 50 states because we know that we have a very diverse political structure in the U.S. and very diverse views, and we can't just focus in one area or another and expect that to be to drive the day. You have to have a broad-based support. But I mean, I'll be honest, in states like Kentucky and otherwise, West Virginia too, I mean, it's challenging. I mean, the conversation's not there right now on as you talked about having the argument with your relative. In some of those places, it's very tough to have that conversation. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't start trying to have that conversation. And in a lot of our state chapters that are in some of those more politically challenging states, I mean, they're taking small steps to just say, what's possible? What are the impacts? Why does this matter? How can we find some solutions that we can talk about, at least start a conversation about? And again, that's the first step. And that's very different than in other states where we have, in California, we have a robust climate change program that's dealing with cap and trade policy and how that carbon pricing market works. So we have that difference, but we recognize that difference is just inherent in working in all 50 states, is a critical part of it, and something that has to be done if we're going to get to the ultimate political solution that we need, which is some type of national carbon pricing policy.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I didn't catch your name. I know you asked Jason the question, but I have an answer. Can I get your first name again? Lars. Let's talk after the session if you have a second. Obviously I agree. There's not an overall answer. The natural gas industry, the renewables industry, the overall electric generation industry as it moves into the future are not going to be able to replace all of the jobs associated with coal generation, right? But one of the really cool things I think about Pennsylvania is there's a conversation happening, largely in Allegheny County and some parts in Scranton in the eastern part of the state that has direct impact in southwestern Pennsylvania. And some of my family's actually from Blairsville, that area, so they're impacted very similarly. And we have a lot of those conversations as well, right, over Thanksgiving dinner that are difficult. But there are different job training programs that are under development right now that will not only be based here in Allegheny County or in the eastern part of the state, but will actually be in partnership with some of the community colleges that are actually in some of the more remote, non-urban areas, so remote areas in Pennsylvania. I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about that. We'll be at a conference in April on the 8th with the municipalities that make up the Allegheny County area, in addition to some of the surrounding areas, to sort of start to think about piloting that project. And that's directly related to taking folks that have been displaced or lost their jobs, right, or live in underserved communities around the state, and give them an opportunity to be trained and possibly enter the workforce that services not only the natural gas industry, but also the local utility industry around the state.
Cool. All right, last two in the hands, or microphones are in hand already.
Hi, I'm Nina Dodge from DC Climate Action, District of Columbia. And I actually had planned to ask another question, but I'm going to switch to energy efficiency. And let's call it lowering demand. And let's be frank, that lowering demand is anathema to the business model of utilities and the power generation industry to a large extent. And as well as being one side of an equation that's quite simple, it's often treated as soft, but in fact it's probably one of the sharpest tools in the room. And it can be easily dismissed as soft and not dealt with because the premises are so threatening. And we see those play out in the energy industry, in the wholesale markets, et cetera. So I'm not going to continue my lecture. I noticed here that, but I think it's good to be honest about these things, and there have been allusions to the business models overall in the energy sector and the utility sector not really being suited towards meeting these goals of decarb, and you know, those of us working in this know how difficult it is, and even not being confrontational, but there's so much to be brought along, and there's so much deep, radical stuff that's involved. Now, in your flyer on electricity workforce for Pennsylvania, Pennsylvanians working in the electricity sector, you have energy efficiency at the top with 37,000 members of the workforce. Coal, 36,200. Natural gas, 33,300. I guess these are the Pennsylvanians involved. Mm-hmm. So I haven't had time to kind of go over the footnotes and how you've gotten these metrics. But I think it's worth just bringing that out.
Yeah.
In terms of, I completely agree with our colleague at large here from Drinker Biddle on the cost-effective power of energy efficiency measures at the policy level and the technical level. I mean, one thing you do have in Pennsylvania historically, I don't know if it still exists, I mean, Westinghouse is still associated with the refrigerators, so I don't know what the manufacturing base is still here. But with our new federal government, there is very quick action on eliminating bills that have been under discussion for not only vehicle emissions, but also one of the big radical bills that was teetering but still had promise was on large building HVAC systems, raising radically the efficiency requirements. I mean, that would have been a game changer. And let's say that will be a game changer. Now, what could Pennsylvania do? You mentioned the California Buddy Act or whatever it is, going along with California's, some of the California provisions maybe for vehicle emissions that are above and beyond the federal ones. What strategies, where are the sweet spots for Pennsylvania becoming a leader on, as California is, on some of these radical measures that have a huge impact as well as create jobs?
And in some ways for time, it's a phenomenal question to maybe be punted and deferred to the breakout sessions.
Yeah.
But
I'm happy to
quickly,
answer that
yeah.
during the breakout session in more detail.
Is that okay? Yeah, because that's the exact kind of thinking we want to have going through that session. All right, last one.
I'll be a quick, great conference, wonderful focus on technical issues, economic issues. But I think the observation is we're talking in a room of friendlies. We may have different opinions about more controversial issues like CCUS and nuclear and whatnot. But are we ignoring the broader issue that is standing in the way of deep decarbonization in Pennsylvania, and that is politics? And to Laura's point earlier, local issues and these social issues really drive local politics. All politics is local. So if we are ignoring some of those issues, some of the issues that really drove the presidential election in many ways, and for a state like Pennsylvania, which has economy has been dependent on the fuel supply chain, we're talking about a future where that supply chain is not offering perhaps the same amount of jobs. How can we look at that issue differently? Should we be looking at those issues around social issues, social policy, legacy issues, incumbent power balance, et cetera?
So,
Yes.
Christina, I think, again, this is a great topic for your panel here in the breakout panel. But I'll just touch really quickly. I don't think there is a future, right, where you don't have to deal with the political dynamics of the oil and gas industry and the coal industry here in Pennsylvania, right? So there's no ignoring, you can't hide, under the sand or what have you, and think that we're going to be able to push a proactive energy efficiency or clean energy framework or even a revision to Act 129, which are the renewable energy standards and portfolio standards here in Pennsylvania, without dealing with, right, sort of the community side of things, but not just the community side of things, right, the oil and gas industry and the coal lobby here in Pennsylvania. So I think the politics are real. We haven't talked a whole lot about that. I have some specific things that I plan on covering in the breakout session relative to some folks' questions. But I think it's a really important point and something that there's just no way to hide from. There are different strategies and different issues that I think lend themselves better to a conversation around markets, a conversation around, as Jason pointed out earlier, building the more moderate conservative base that's more, at least from the issues we're talking about, more interested in supporting clean energy initiatives than they are in supporting lower natural gas production or something like that, which sort of is obvious. But that's a great observation, and I think something that we should take very seriously, and I'll cover it a little bit more in the breakout session as well.
Just on the politics point, my observations on the political right, the climate skeptic world, a lot of what I hear is not so much that we necessarily doubt the science or this is what you get after the second beer, but we just don't like the solution set. It just, Jim Inhofe was quoted a couple weeks ago as saying, I thought climate was real until I figured out what the price tag was. So let me make a humble suggestion as you think about Pennsylvania. The portfolio approach is not only what I think you're going to need to have the maximum chance of solving the problem, it might also be really politically smart. Just take my example of thinking about natural gas in Pennsylvania as a feedstock for zero carbon power and zero carbon liquid fuels, and think about building an industry around that. Think about the politics of that, not to the exclusion of renewables or anything else, but think about focusing on that and think about maybe, whether that might actually bring more people into the climate discussion. Just a question.
All right, last word.
Anna Stiefkin, Carnegie Mellon. Thank you, Davitt, for the last, it's actually a comment and an invitation. So during Energy Week, which is from March the 27th through the 31st, we're actually spending an entire day on energy efficiency, and workforce. So anyone who would like to receive, it's a private meeting, it's a roundtable, but if you'd like an invitation, just hand me your business card because this is the exact topic. We're going to be talking about it all day. So thank you.
All right, so we're not ending this conversation. We're suspending it for a few minutes here. Thank you all. Thank the three of you for this. I appreciate it.